All right, y'all. So now I'm going to do some rapid fire looks at some of these books that I read on my list. Some rapid fire. So if you this might be like a part two. So you'll have to kind of like look at my TBR in the month of January for some of these books because I really don't want to try to talk about what they're about, the synopsis. But I did put on my list The Son of Storm, which I love that book. I I think that I said when I first made my TBR video for January, I was so deep into that book that I expressed pretty much everything that I was loving about that book at the time. It did conclude on a solid note, although I was kind of sad about the fate of one character, but it did conclude on a solid note. And I do have the copy of the second book already in my other library somewhere. How many bookshelves do I got? But I do got another copy of the second book already in place. And I bought a copy of the first book because, once I check it out from the library and I like it well enough, I'm going to buy my own copy. So The Son of Storm was an A+ for me. Blackheart Man by Nalo Hopkinson. I told you guys about this, but I got wrong some of the cultural references that I was anticipating was going to be present within this book based off of the cover. I said Native American and African. It's much more African and Caribbean folklore and themes surrounding this particular story. This book was good in the sense that it kept me guessing. It kept me hooked on. Well, I won't say hooked, but it kept me Okay, here. Okay, listen. Black Man Heart. Let me give it to you like this. Black Man Heart had to do with this gentleman. This is Afro futuristic speculative fiction. They live on this island. The author is playing with colonization and colonizers trying to come to one island, and then they're not getting successful in conquering that island, so they leave and then they return back. During the course of that, in the past, some of the colonizers, or pretty much the people they subjugated to being like their soldiers, if you will, from another tribe, they are trapped within this tar pit that was created by these witches, etc., etc. The point I'm getting to is that I love this book, but it's gonna be a book. It's a book that you have to read a couple of times to really grasp what's going on. It's one of those books, speculative fiction wise, where this is asking for a whole lot from the reader, a lot of stuff that just don't make sense. You have to read the book multiple times to get it, and that is down to just the language of the characters themselves. For example, Pickens is what you learn is mean children, but that's not as difficult as just kind of grasping all the folklore that the author's playing with and just seeing what the general direction of the book is. Because with that being said, if it was not about these people trapped within this tar pit who was slowly coming back alive, then I would have probably not finished this book. That was the core thing that made me want to read the book, was understanding precisely what happened to these individuals. How did they end up in the tar pit by these three witches, and what is the concurrent issue that we're going to have with them being revitalized here in the future, and what kind of mayhem and madness are they going to create within the current community in which they now are shuffled off to. That was the biggest reason why I finished this book. Other than that, I probably would not have. And even with that, it still wasn't demanding or damning enough to me anyway. I'm not saying it's a negative. I'm not saying it's a positive. But it did not hit all the bells and whistles, but it brushed against a couple of them. And one of the things that the author did that I just absolutely do not like is that she employed it's not a dream sequence, because y'all know I abhor dream sequences, but she did the amnesia trick. Why? I don't know. So basically, our main character is doing things off the page, away from the eyes of the us, the reader, and then subsequently down the line, we kind of get this snap realization through him that he was the one responsible for a sequence of events that we were not privy to as the reader. Please, I'm not interested in that. Do not do that. That's such a cheap shot to do it that way. And then it was something that would have driven some much more compelling points within the story, in which it would have really made me much more engrossed to see how the concluding story was going to be. But because that was all done off stage, it was just like, why are you telling me this now? So anyway, Blackheart Man, yeah, somewhere in between there. Then I read Communion, which is supposed to be, I don't have his name. It's a nonfiction, supposed to be nonfiction book about this man's experience, both much more from a psychological standpoint of being abducted by aliens. Now, y'all don't judge me. You can judge me anyway because people been judging me all my life. But I don't know. I just want to read something scary, and I just happened to hear a podcaster mention Communion. He was like, "This book was one of the scariest books he ever read." You know, thinking about alien abduction and the mind games that they play with their human victims, and I wasn't scared about anything. I wasn't scared about anything in this book. I was like, no, it's really not that scary and creepy. I do like the visuals that the author presented, but I was not totally scared or creeped out. And it was one of those books where I had gotten a certain number of pages in, not thoroughly gung-ho to finish it, not thoroughly repelled by it, that I just switched to the audiobook form, played some Tomb Raider, and just let the story play, and I got everything I pretty much needed. So I read Communion. It's one of those variables that sometimes I stick my feet in and just kind of hang on for. After I read Communion, I read The Night Ward by R.S.A. Garcia. I think that's right. Anyway, I mentioned this book also in my TBR for the month of January, as it has to do with this. But the overall Caribbean folklore is the color, the dressing of the story, but it has to do with this girl who's like 9 years old. She's about to become like some sort of like a religious figure, but not exactly religious, but there's a coronation of sorts for her, but she's a princess, and then her mother ends up getting murdered during this quote-unquote coronation. That's not the right ceremonial term for this, given that it is speculative fiction or fantasy. But her mother's murdered. There's a coup going on because it's happened within the castle, within the empire, and then she is subsequently ushered off by her guardian to outside the castle, outside of the premise, to eventually come back around to reclaim the throne. Classic fantasy stuff. I love this book. I actually really did like this book, but I did have a couple of troubles. And really, that's not a lot. The first thing I want to go ahead and just say before I get into just this one thing that really just bugged me about this book, if you're looking for a fantasy book, it is kind of like a low grade, and that's not a derogative. I'm not being mean by that, because if anybody knows how much effort it takes to read and probably most certainly write a Wheel of Time book by Robert Jordan, then yeah, you would get my point. But it did seem like it was this book was had some influences by Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. There was that same taste, I guess you can say, although very brimming of epicness from an epic fantasy book by like a Robert Jordan. And even some of the things like portals that they use is kind of reminiscent of that to me. So it had, to me, having concluded the book, it felt like a little inspired by the Wheel of Time, but it also felt like, because surprisingly there's a science fiction element to it. So she's ushering in not only the Caribbean folklore, but fantasy, high fantasy, and science fiction. And on the science fiction point, it kind of made me think about Horizon Zero Dawn, or the Horizon series, the video game series. Kind of pull both of those in, like these underground bunkers filled with this, well, they call them cauldrons in the game, but filled with this technology, this AI life force that communicates, through various means on the planet Earth, if you will. So it felt like a blend of both of those two. And I was really shocked when the science fiction elements kind of merged into it. And that's the thing is that's one of the core reasons why I cannot wait for the second book, because the book left off on a very interesting note, where we're now grappling with not only the fantasy on the back end of our characters, but the future is starting to come in, or the science fiction elements are starting to really pull themselves forward. So the Night Ward was a winner for me. It was great. Like I said, like I can say now, the only thing that got on my nerves was that a lot of the characters with the title of lady, like Lady Gretchen, lady this, lady that, lady that, lady this, that, that. Like I said, a low grade Robert Jordan character inspired book when it comes to fantasy. I couldn't get any of those names right. I couldn't get any of those characters right. They were not distinguished enough for me. No matter how many you give them their respective kingdoms or respective land masses contained within the map of the book. There was no, I couldn't distinguish any of them apart. So, you know, it come to a point where these ladies was constantly coming on stage, and I just kind of turned my brain off and was like, okay, well, yeah, she's like a, I don't know her. She's an NPC. How is she different from the other lady in a few chapters 4? I know intellectually it's there, but when it comes to the characterization and how they're expressed on the page, it's not clear enough for me. So I was just like, whatever. Only the characters who are much more vibrant and clear to me were the characters that I kept my centered focus on. So anyway, the Night Ward was still good. Next I read Percival Everett's James. Finally read James. A fantastic book. As you guys know, this is the Huckleberry Finn reflective version of the character of James in Huckleberry Finn. You know, I think this book is fairly popular enough that I don't really have to get into like the synopsis. But what this book left me with that I loved, that I absolutely love, I love that it still had that. And although I've never read Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, and I'm absolutely not interested in reading any of them at this point. At one point I thought I would be, but I'm not now. It's still kind of, from what I gathered, maybe from watching films, it still had that taste of adventure out on the river rafting adventure. You know, get into these little episodic moments with different characters and groups all along the journey. It still had that taste to me. It was like a much more mature version of Huckleberry Finn's story, you know, which would be the case anyway, given the character of James as the slave. But what I love most about this story, or James, is I love all these very incidental moments where the author, used his characters, especially that of slaves, to give commentary on how they perceived the white characters or slave owners or whatnot perceiving them, and how they adjusted and manipulated themselves around their particular gaze. One instance is how they code switch from, you know, having proper or just streamlined proper English or using proper grammar to that of when they're in the presence of the white characters. There's that bit of choppiness, you know. I don't know, swallowing of words is one way of putting it, because I do that anyway now. But you know, they give that what you would expect these characters to speak like, you know, like Mrs. and Missa and all that kind of stuff, that kind of foolishness. So I love that expressed there. I love that Everett has taken over that, how that was written, that voice, or how that was written in times in which Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, whoever the hell them folks are, how the authors used to write black characters. Then he kind of took that back and showed us what that really meant, or why that was really expressed and showed, you know, through the character of James and all his different cohorts of black slaves. So I love that. That was great. He did several other things within this book, and I actually bought a copy, and I must be in my other bookshelf. He did several other things in this book that I really enjoyed, that were equally as poignant as, you know, him going in on like the code switching that African slaves or black slaves would do when it came to in and out of engagements with white characters. So that's one of the reasons why I think this book was just like, I just love this book. It was so subtle, so much nuance in how this character of James had to traverse this world and who he interacted with. And I love some of those sharp thoughts that he would express on the page, and sometimes it'll be a slip, and some of the white characters, they'll like, you know, they'll tense up because they like, but at the same time, when I think about it, that's such well, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be known how sad that is to have to live like that, but just all around great book. Yeah, I understand why that book won a lot of won a lot of prizes and stuff, and I read it really quick. I read it in like 3 days. That's how easy it flows through. Just go right on through. So I read James. Definitely a thumbs up. And then the last book that I just finished reading was Bonded in Death by J.D. Robb. And I ain't gonna even tell you how much I love that book because y'all already know that I love that book. It's actually right there. Can you see that? Let me pull it out the shelf. No, I ain't gonna pull it out. But Bonded in Death by J.D. Robb. This is book number 60 in the series, okay? 61 comes out in September of this year. So, and I cannot wait. A lifelong dedicated fan of J.D. Robb. I love Eve Dallas, her futuristic police lieutenant, homicide detective lieutenant. I love her husband Rourke. I love the setting of New York in 2061. The crimes are always different. In this case, it had to do with this group of spies who her butler is actually a part of that group, and one of their team members in the past betrayed them, and now he's trying to carry out, his vengeance on the rest of the they call them the 12, in subsequent order in which he wants to kill them off, and Eve Dallas gets in the between all that. So, classic J.D. Robb stuff, nothing really too fantastic to even talk about because at the end of the day, I just love these books, period, point blank. Some of them I like, some of them I don't so much, but Bonded in Death was definitely one of her, a 4-star, at least for me. So, and after reading that book, it's just like, I really want to read more J.D. Robb stuff, but I read everything. So I have to wait till September for the new thing. So I'm thinking about rereading the first book, Naked in Death, for the first time since, I haven't touched that book since 2008. So that's a long time. So I'm thinking about rereading that book as a part of March Mystery Madness. So I can close out my thing here. I'm pretty sure I didn't make any sense when I spoke about any of these books, but that's okay because I think most people know already about these books. Oh, I got to call her. I forgot her number was in there. And yeah, that's kind of it. See you next time.